90% of online content, of everything you see on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, is being generated by dark triad sociopaths.
Jamie Wheal is a renowned expert on the interaction of peak performance, neuroscience, and flow states. Jamie has dedicated his life's work to understanding how individuals and organizations can unlock their full potential and tap into states of peak performance.
In this day and age, as all of our stories have collapsed, what on earth is the meaning of life? And as we look around our news feeds, why? Why is there so much suffering? Are we innately bad? Are we corrupt? Are we wrong?
Sometimes out of that novelty comes complexity. Cancer is complex, right? ISIS is complex. There's a lot of things that come out that are not necessarily wonderful, but some things that are increasingly complex are good, true, or beautiful.
Okay.
And we see that emergence, and then we as stewards, self-aware stewards of this evolutionary process, get to say, hey, that stuff, let's do more of that. Let's preserve that. Let's protect that. But the trick with a complex system is the complex system needs ever increasing amounts of energy to keep it going. It's a complex dissipative structure is the name of it, right? And the moment you turn off the tap of extra energy to keep it growing and stable, it dissipates or collapses again. The story of human civilization has been nothing more nor less than the hunt for ever hotter fire to heat ever more interesting star stuff.
Hello and welcome to Kaplankaya on the southwestern Aegean coast of Turkey. We are recording the podcast, the Harvest series, where we interview amazing speakers, practitioners, and artists joining the Harvest Summit. I hope you will enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to the Harvest series podcast. Today my guest is Jamie Wheal, and this is the third time he's here on this podcast as is very special for Harvest. This year again he's been helping to curate the 8th Summit of Kaplankaya. Jamie is a renowned expert on the interaction of peak performance, neuroscience and flow states. As the executive director of the Flow Genome Project, Jamie has dedicated his life's work to understanding how individuals and organizations can unlock their full potential and tap into states of peak performance. He's the author of Recapture the Rapture, and in this episode, we'll discuss about radical connection and Jamie's latest projects. Hello, Jamie.
Hello.
Nice to have you here again.
Great to be back.
In a different setup.
Yeah.
As we're about to start this 8th season of Harvest in Kaplankaya, could you explain how you chose the theme Radical Connection this year and what it means in a world where conflicts and wars, as in Ukraine or in Gaza, are making the headlines?
Sure. I mean, some of it was in honor of one of our guest speakers, Esther Perel, and knowing that her work is so explicitly focused on that. And so we thought, well, gosh, if Esther is going to be coming and speaking and speaking from her heart and from the body of her work, it felt like such an easy and obvious extension to the theme of last year, which was radical hope. And radical hope doesn't just mean sort of super duper extra hope. It wasn't just an adjective in front of a good word.
Yeah.
It's actually an academic term from Jonathan Lear at the University of Chicago. And so he coined the term radical hope, looking at American Indian reservations in the 19th century and interviewing many of the, or sort of, obviously reviewing the oral histories of that time and what happened when a people had experienced such crisis and such trauma and had removed from their sacred lands, removed from the burial sites and places of their ancestors, and then pulled onto reservations in dusty, flat, miserable lands elsewhere. How did a culture keep hope? And he said radical hope isn't just sort of hoping that the ship will right itself or that we'll get back to the good old days. Radical hope is a belief in a future you cannot see from here, but you choose to believe in nonetheless.
Okay.
So as we extended it to this year, we think, okay, well, what else is around there? What else do we need? What are the building blocks that we need as people, as families, as communities, as countries, and even as our collective civilization? And radical connection clearly feels like one, because we're experiencing, radical disconnection at every level of our being.
Right.
We're disconnected from ourselves, right? We're disconnected from our bodies. We're disconnected from even our food and our diets. We're even disconnected from our minds and attention these days with the onslaught of phones and digital media and all of these things. And so what does it mean first, obviously, to connect, to reconnect to ourselves? And it is radical these days. It's a radical act to not just be, hijacked by the bottom of our brain stems as just sort of dopamine slot machine monkeys, just conditioned to poke, swipe, flip, scroll, like that. It's a radical thing to disconnect from that. It's a radical thing to eat real foods. It's a radical thing to actually be fully embodied. So first step, that. Then once we connect to ourselves, what does it mean to connect in community, in relationship to each other? And, and that's everything from friendships to family to the places we live. What does it mean for us to connect? Because, it's easy to idealize a sort of nostalgic version of old traditional communities, intergenerational, local. Most people are, born, live, and work and die in the same places, and we sort of almost fetishize community these days, right? And the reality is that they were hard. It was nitty and gritty. There was
and
a lot
unfair sometimes,
unfair,
right.
bigoted, biased, prejudiced, insular, rigid. There was also, like if you weren't a certain type in a certain way, you were ostracized. So the very, very little room for or tolerance for freaks and misfits and creatives. So you're like, okay, so how do we manage the inevitable frictions and tensions of staying connected in community? And for sure, there are, old things that we are happy to leave in the past, all those things we were just mentioning, but there are also some profoundly, useful and even vital social technologies. We were just talking with my partner Julie had just done a panel at a recent event that we were speaking at, and it was a collection of women, and they were talking about, the challenges of motherhood in the modern age. And there was a woman who was in Costa Rica, and I think maybe a woman in Portugal, and they said, what are you trying to do raising your children by yourself away from your mother and grandmother and in a society that has no acknowledgement or recognition of motherhood? She said, in Costa Rica, we get whisked to the front of all the lines, and I live in a compound with my mother and my grandmother. I can't even think about what it would be like to raise a child completely isolated by myself. So just simple steps of what are the potentially restrictive things that we are happy to say goodbye to, but actually to go back and say, what are some of the essential, social immune systems and support structures and networks? How do we connect as community? Because it also requires, as we are seeing in the Middle East, as we are seeing in many inner cities and mega cities, and as we're seeing kind of, pretty much at every level of social organization these days, getting irritated, sowing division, not being able to fundamentally metabolize our grief, right? And the inevitable tensions of who gets what and why is another massive, massive thing. And then finally, obviously as we roll up from connecting to ourselves and connecting to our communities and relationships, then there's the sort of our collection of collections of all of us on this earth. And what does it mean to pan back a bit and just sort of say, hey, spaceship Earth, team human, how are we doing this thing? Because as many folks listening to this and reading their own news feeds and things like that, we're in a bit of a tight spot. And it does seem that one of the unintended consequences of the last couple of 100 years, of unchecked global growth and heightened energy consumption and all of the, and population doubling and trebling in that time, that we are in an unprecedented spot together. And if we can't stay connected at that level of our global challenges, then we sort of go rocketing back down the slide, and we sort of explode our community connections because we get hijacked by demagogues and populists and ethno-nationalists and others saying it's their fault that all these things are happening, not it's our collective responsibility to fix them. And then we end up all the way down to fractured and isolated individuals that say, I don't have, there's that famous Harvard longevity study that's been going on for like 75 years, and they've taken, studied a cohort, right? And then always the headline is always, hey, the number one magic secret to a good long life is connections.
Yeah.
And
relationship,
so, right?
healthy relationship in the end.
Yeah. So if we break at the level of the world and we break at the level of the communities, we end up with disconnected, isolated, fragmented, consumer zoo animals that are saying, what's the point? And then we end up with diseases of despair. And we end up with more and more people saying, I don't have a reason to live. I don't have a reason to look after myself, to love myself, to be passionate, to make a contribution to whatever it might be. So that's the sort of stack, and these are the stakes. So for us to figure out how do we deepen our connections, for all the marbles, right, at the end of time, at the end of history, feels like a worthy inquiry.
Yeah. True. You mentioned team humans and the demagogues. Do you think they are the person responsible for not making us feel really on a day-to-day life, feel like we belong to the same team in this planet?
Yeah, it's so sort of fascinating to watch all this stuff, right? Because, there have been some really eye-opening studies, and I think you can't say this often enough, but basically, in fact, our colleague Tristan Harris, who spoke at Harvest last year, right, who wrote The Social Dilemma, and he is one of the co-founders of the Center for Humane Technology. So they've been speaking about the perils of social and digital screens, but also now artificial intelligence and just all things, digital, and how should we steward them. And so 10% of humans are generating 90% of the content we see, and it's from the extreme left and the extreme right. And then another study that I featured in my last book was that they did a study on alt-right, effectively neo-Nazis, and far left sort of social justice activists, and then centrists, the kind of moderate middle, and they assessed them on 4 personality types: authoritarianism, and then what's known as the dark triad, which is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy.
Okay.
So those 3 plus authoritarianism, but generally not nice people. and the far right and the far left both scored very strongly correlated with those 4 horrible qualities.
Okay.
And the people in the middle that were somewhere in that kind of Republican in French, or liberal, liberalism, kind of classical sense of live and let live, and these are my opinions, but but other people are entitled to this. Those folks didn't score on those at all.
Okay, interesting.
So what you realize is you're like, oh my gosh, so 5% on the far left, 5% on the far right makes the 10% that are generating 90% of what we think of humanity. Mm-hmm. Okay. 90% of what we think of our fellow humans is being generated by dark triad sociopaths.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So when we think we are so far apart, and you get online, I don't know about you, but I can spend no longer than 2 or 3 minutes on Instagram before I put my phone down in disgust and say, I fucking hate humans.
Okay.
Or you watch Twitter spats and you're like, Jesus Christ, is this really what this has come to? And it's actually a massive distortion of where the overwhelming 90% of humans are, which is fundamentally committed to some version of live and let live, some version of, I would like my children to enjoy a better life than I did and than my parents did. And I'd like to die in my sleep someday surrounded by my grandkids. Right? Like that's humans, and it always has been. Right? Whether it was, dodging, Caesar's taxmen, or not wanting your sons to get conscripted into a bullshit war far, far away, right? Or it's just the ability to live in peace, and think of our global refugee crisis. There's all of this sort of ethno-nationalism. Right? We were just, I think this is on Patmos, or maybe it was on Laros, but we were just on the Greek islands, right? And on the far side of the Greek islands was a very, industrial, barbed wire, spotlight refugee camp. And it was for Syrians. It was for all sorts of people coming from North Africa and the Middle East, across the Mediterranean, trying to seek refuge and asylum. In the United States, you have the southern border, which is now not at all just Mexicans attempting to come across the border, which has always been porous and was actually Spanish and Mexican land long before it was the United States. It's folks coming all the way up from Guatemala, from Honduras, even other countries like Chinese people are landing in Central America and making their way up. And, you have politicians like Donald Trump sort of saying, build a wall, and these are drug dealers and rapists and all of these horrible, horrible things. But really, they are humans, and they are people that if they had any choice in the matter, overwhelmingly would like to stay in the land they were born and raised in, where their family's from, with the food and the climate and the landscapes that they, most of us yearn for home.
Yeah.
So as we're facing, the UN, I think, has said that by 2050, there may be up to 1 billion climate refugees. And there's been a recent study, I think about 6 to 9 months ago, just sort of showing the band of habitability on the earth, right? Just where are the temperate climates that are in that sort of Goldilocks zone? And that's where, that's all of Western Europe. That's all, they're basically not too hot, not too cold. You're right at the equator. You have bad soil quality. You have high diseases, right? Sure. Gnarly. And if it's too north or too south, it's too cold, right? So there are these sweet spots, and those sweet spots are shrinking. And of course, the people can't move as rapidly as the climatic conditions are changing. So what that means is an awful lot of people are getting pulled out of habitable zones. And what have we always done, right? Because, if people don't always realize this, if you read Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, or any of those kind of big, long histories of human civilization, everybody's like, we were hunters and gatherers and we did all these kind of things. And then about 10,000 years ago, we started settling down in cities.
People moved.
And people think, you sort of just take that for granted. That's kind of children's school book sort of stuff. But the reality is that there was this crazy climactic anomaly where for the past 100,000 years, right, temperatures had gone plus or minus 10 degrees Celsius every decade. Wild temperature fluctuations. The only way to deal with that was to migrate constantly.
Yeah.
Right? You had to go where the climate suited your clothes, right? Otherwise, you snuffed it. And then 10,000 years ago, or 11,000 years ago, the temperature just flatlines. It used to look like a seismograph or a stock market. Wild swings, and then 10,000 years ago, boop, and it's plus or minus 1 degree every century. And now we're talking about 1.5 degrees, we're talking about 2 degrees, we're talking about these numbers. But to put it in context, right? Humans or hominids survived much, much, much higher variability, but there weren't that many of us, and we were always on the move. So if you fast forward that now to 8 billion humans trending to 10 billion before we then crest and dip again, the only solution to this will be hypermobility and lots of migration. And lots of migration can go one of two ways. You either take it as humanitarian hospitality, the sort of, Afghan and Pakistani, notion of, I would also even Turkish, of sort of the sacred hospitality of the host and guest, the 3 cups of tea. Mm-hmm, if you come to my threshold seeking aid, right, it is my obligation to host you. Can we do that? And in fact, Wade Davis, who is also a multi-time harvest speaker, we were with him in Mexico earlier this year. And he was telling a beautiful story of being in the Sahara, looking at these salt mines, and they were traveling, and apparently the salt mines are just gnarly, like literally as hellish a zone to work and labor under harsh conditions as possible. But they chisel out these blocks of salt and they take them in camel caravans across the desert. And he said that they were going there, and then there was this freak rainstorm, and it melted all the salt, ruined it. So like all of this work was done, and then they came across this bunch of and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I would say placeholder Bedouins.
Okay.
But there they were, and they had been lost in this sandstorm, and Wade's National Geographic Explorer crew came upon them, and they were down to their last half a liter of water. And the very first thing they did was break out their little cook stove kit and start brewing up tea to offer Wade and their people.
Right. That's hospitality. Yeah.
Yeah. So radical connection.
Yeah.
Right? How do we do this? Because if we don't do anything different, this goes back to what you were sharing about your history teacher in school.
Yes. So to get people involved, my history teacher said like a long time ago that men are made for war because Cain killed his brother Abel in the Bible, and that maybe we have a feeling we're more disconnected and there are more wars today because we're kind of, in a way, we're more connected to the news and to the headlines, but maybe there's always been like a war in the past since the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and well, also, I think your point there is we are infinitely more aware in real time. We have never, I mean, Ukraine was arguably the first extremely online and extremely digital war that we've seen. You had Ukrainian soldiers, on WhatsApp, and the same with Gaza, right? We had real time, instantly distributable, visceral video capture of what was happening over there. And over there became right here in our living rooms, on our screens, in our faces. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that our collective awareness of global conflicts and suffering is higher than it's ever been because of instant distributed video technologies, and everybody has a sort of publishing industry, publishing sort of platform in their pockets. But compared to the past, this is still more peaceful time period than it has ever been. And all studies of like Steven Pinker at Harvard and, Enlightenment Now and Hans Rosling, and the Gapminder Project and the, what is their name? Max Rosling and took over that project, but it's in Our World in Data.
Okay.
So there's a lot of that story, but you could also make a case that, a lot of that statistical piece, obviously doesn't include Stalin, Mao, World War I, and World War II.
Yeah.
Like that's a pretty gnarly chunk of humanity. Yeah. And we just happen to have had what, some historians call the Pax Americana, right? That sort of post-1945 Bretton Woods peace, which is arguably come to an end.
Yeah.
Right? We had a bipolar world in the Cold War. Berlin Wall falls. We had a sort of unipolar world.
Yeah, it's been an unusual moment of peace in a way, like even if it's
unusual and unraveled. Mm-hmm. So now we're going back to a multipolar world with regional spheres of influence, with Russia making its play, China making its play, Iran making its play, the US as a fading sphere of influence and withdrawing, kind of rolling up its drawbridges, especially if we elect the Republican challenger again. That will be the end of UN, NGO, NATO community. We can't undo those things if they go that way. And so the questions are, what are the main driving three forces that at least I can sort of identify that are creating this disconnection? And to the point of your teacher's question, the number one deepest structure, and it basically in our civilizational calculus, right? If you sort of take a look, how do we do this thing together? Mm-hmm. Obviously, we're not doing it exactly perfectly, right? Because there's all these errors in our mathematics.
Yeah.
Right? We have externalities. We have things that we didn't account for. And so tribalism creates a psychosocial externality, which is us versus them.
Yeah.
If you're inside our group, it's all good. You're a human. You're a citizen, right? You're one of the elect, and you're deserving care, concern, etc. But we can only do that by creating a them. And the thems are pagans, they're barbarians, they're apostates, they're heretics, they're infidels, they're whatever they might be, but they are not entitled to human care and concern. Yeah. So that's how we play the tribal game. And tribalism is the most deeply rooted structure that we are hardwired to care about and encode. So it happens at a biological level. Obviously, oxytocin is a mother suckling her child, gazing into their eyes, pair bonding. There's kith and kin. There's who is my family. There's who is my clan, who is my tribe, right? And that is actually neurochemically enforced. And oxytocin, everybody, if you sort of read pop science, you might think, oh, that's the love drug, that's the cuddle molecule, that's all those things, but it's actually also the ethnocentric tribal bonding molecule.
Yeah, okay.
So it fuels football hooligans, it fuels political rallies, it fuels all sorts of things where, and my caring concern for my group tightens, but my willingness to be mean and or aggressive to the other goes up also.
Oh, Julie Holland said that during the podcast. Yeah, okay.
Right?
That's excluding, like including but excluding. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's tribalism, and that is biologically encoded, and the externality, right, is us versus them. It's the other. So then you think, what else do we have going on? The next step is after we have a tribe, right? Sometimes, and whether this is Mehmet II or Ataturk in Turkey, whether this is Alfred the Great in England or Charlemagne in France, right? We have the great unifiers. Yeah. And they're like, all you scattered tribes, we're going to roll this thing up and we're going to give it a new name, and I'm going to sit on top of that, right? So you have the great unifiers where you go tribalism segues into nationalism, but it's the same fundamental drivers, right? The French, the British or England, right? All of those kind of notions, right? So it's the same dynamic. Well, what happens then is you basically go from trade among tribes, right, which was usually somewhat reciprocal. I mean, there was raiding and trading, right, so that the nomads would often come to the farmers, and they would sort of come in the front gate by the daytime and would say, we'd like to trade with you. They'd sort of eye the things that you didn't want to trade, and we might come back and steal them late at night, right, that kind of thing. But generally, trade was sort of reciprocal. And David Graeber's work on that with his book Debt, the First 10,000 Years, talks about that. He's like, the first money was actually debt. It wasn't barter. Barter is what you did with the strangers you didn't trust. Debt was what you did with the people you interconnected with. Right. So there was always that reciprocity of exchange. That's how we did this thing. Yeah. So what happens after you go from trade into nations is nations then start saying, hey, what is trade at the point of a sword? Asymmetrical trade, not reciprocal trade. So asymmetrical trade at the point of the sword is fundamentally colonialism. Mm-hmm. We're going to take your shit. Right? And
because we're stronger. Yeah.
Right? And the externality at the level of colonialism is here versus there. It's a geographic externality. We're going to take your natural resources, your human labor, whatever it might be from there, and bring it over here, which is fundamentally, and it's not, and it predates Western European colonialism. It predates U.S. colonialism. This is an ancient, deep structure of all empire. Yeah. So level one is tribalism. The externality is social, us versus them. Yeah. Colonialism, the externality is geographic, right? Here versus there. Then you get to the next level, which is capitalism. And capitalism, it basically is a temporal, right, or time-based externality, which is now versus later. We want to extract profits now maximally. Yeah. And we don't, there's an expression, farmers' expression in the United States of like, we don't want to be eating our seed corn, right? Our seed corn is the seeds you save for the next year to plant. Yeah. Okay. Right? If you start eating your seeds because it's food, you don't have food later, but you eat now. Yeah. That's an act of desperation in any situation. But in capitalism, the incentives are this quarterly profit, this year. If you're leaving any corn, if you're leaving anything unharvested, you're sub-optimizing your returns.
So your enemy is your grandchild.
Yes. So with fossil fuels, everybody knows that phrase, right? We are taking 100 million years of buried starlight, and we've dug it up out of the ground and we've set it on fire. And that creates the most insane thing ever. There's, everyone's familiar, we're 8 billion humans now. We are harnessing the energy equivalent of up to 500 billion fossil fuel slaves that are working for us right now. So if we kind of think we live like kings, it's because we have 500 billion fossil fuel slaves, the equivalent of that much effort. And what we're really doing is we're enslaving our great-grandchildren with the debt. But no one can back off this and say enough's enough. Right? Because we've become quite accustomed to this amount of
solutions being found by themselves also. We have this feeling a little bit of laziness that a solution, maybe now technology is solving everything.
Exactly. So when we take a look at where do we go from here, right? You sort of, a question behind a lot of the questions is is the way forward further even faster, which will be space, space exploration and colonies on Mars, artificial intelligence that will tell us how to fix this stuff, right? New gene editing and new agricultural technologies, all this stuff. But we must go further, faster. We've always fixed these problems by solving for the next one. Let's do that. And anybody who's trying to be a Luddite, right, or anything along these lines, right? I mean, you know this from French, right? When with saboteur, right, is sabot the clog, right? It's throwing the clogs in the gears of the machine.
And we have this auto-saboteur.
So, Silicon Valley is kind of the embodiment of this. These days, there's even an emerging movement called effective accelerationism.
Okay. Yeah.
So, it's a play on effective altruism. So that was William McCaskill and Nick Bostrom at Oxford that sort of articulated effective altruism, which was how do we do the greatest good for the greatest number of people here, now, and everywhere. And it became a very hyper-rational sense of how do we make decisions on the greater good. Right? Yeah. And Sam Bankman-Fried was a young guy who created this multi-billion-dollar crypto fund that then went down in flames. It's become one of the bigger scandals of the last few years. He was giving them tons of money, and it was sort of, and Elon Musk was tweeting about it favorably and all these kinds of things. Okay. And they made an argument that any decision today, we have to be thinking of the future trillions of humans, not billions, but trillions of humans that are yet to be born. And if we don't make it to space so that we can become an interplanetary spacefaring species, we are killing all of those future trillions. Therefore, any decisions we make today, we have their blood on our hands if we don't create the conditions by which they can have a shot, which on the one hand is really inspiring. Hey, we're not at the end of our story. We're really at the baby beginnings, and there's so many new wonderful things to come. Great. But also super problematic, because they can also say by that logic, no point trying to save Africa. Put your money into space exploration. Africa's stuffed, right?
Okay,
don't worry about India. Okay. Too many people, not going to work out, and chasing, trying to alleviate poverty of people who are never going to get education or degrees and contribute to our advanced technological society aren't worth saving anyway. It's the future trillions. The ones we act. So it's got deeply problematic implications if you follow it rigidly. Okay. And that sort of went down in flames with a combination of the Oxford Institute losing its funding and Sam Bankman-Fried, who was one of its most visible sponsors, collapsing. Because his whole point was basically it's make as much money as you possibly can to then do good with that money, which is obviously a devil's deal. And not everybody remembers their ethics after they've pursued extraction of profits at all costs.
Interesting, yeah.
So from that wreckage of the last few years has come, especially in the last 18 months of artificial intelligence booming and really kind of coming into everybody's consciousness, is effective accelerationism. And effective accelerationism compared to altruism is basically saying anybody who gets in the way of our fastest rush to artificial general intelligence, which is sort of, self-aware AI, not just the chat GPTs and the little kind of answer boxes, things that everyone's playing with right now, but actually literally God mode. Mark Andreessen, who's a very well-known Silicon Valley venture capitalist, said, we are teaching sand to think. Right? Which is crazy, right? It's a mind-bending proposition, but those guys are aggressively in the only solution is faster forwards. And they even called anybody who's cautious or anybody who's saying we should pump the brakes or really think this through, doomers. Or even decels, which is a play on the gender war thing of incels, the involuntary celibates, which have been young men who feel displaced and don't have mates, and there's kind of this whole toxic masculine online community. So they've been riffing on that and then calling these people decels and doomers. So anybody who says, so really the question is the way forward further faster, or did we take a wrong turn somewhere? Was there a path of happiness, prosperity, meaning, and we actually missed a fork in the road? And again, if you go back to Yuval Harari, you see that in his story, right? In Sapiens, he basically says, hey, hunter-gatherers, we had great nutrition, we had a lot of leisure time, we had a more even distribution of work and power between the sexes and genders, and then 10,000 years ago, right? We started farming, we confined and constrained ourselves, patriarchy happened, hierarchical religion happened, lousy diets and disease happened, war happened, all the bad things happened, so we should, implication, we should wind back the clock. That was the fall from grace. Was the advent of agriculture, and many people have been kind of echoing, which this is not a new concept. These cycle through, and the last time was probably in the late 60s, like back to the land, voluntary simplicity, all this kind of stuff. But Yuval and a handful of other prominent writers and thinkers have been dusting that chestnut off again, and so the question becomes, how can we deal with these profoundly unique situations we're in? Which is, very specifically 8 billion humans on this planet, right? With a standard of living, and this depends on how you count it, but some estimates have said that if you wanted to raise everybody to the standards of living of Western Europe and North America, you would need the natural resources of 3 to 4 planet Earths. So we just simply don't have enough stuff. Right? Yeah. And so voluntary simplicity or reduction or drawing down of standards of living that the first world is accustomed to right now is politically untenable, right? And there's virtually no politician that can get elected and say, hello, citizens.
Frugality, yeah.
I won. We've taken way too much stuff for far too long, and we all need to massively tighten our belts. So random brown people in the global south, right? Again, tribalism, nationalism, not like us. Don't worship the same gods. Don't eat the same foods. Don't participate in the, don't read the same books and stories, et cetera, et cetera. We need to deprive, because we all get very accustomed very quickly, the hedonic adaptation, right? Like something is new and delightful until you're used to it, and then it's a hardship to have it taken away, right? To then give others their due. That is unlikely to happen unless you had sort of, a Plato sort of philosopher king or enlightened despot, right? Unless you just had somebody with total control,
who
actually was a saint, and then said, "Hey, we're gonna do this in a better
dangerous.
way."
Yeah.
Right, and part of this thing, it's so baffling and so confounding and confusing to sort of think, well, dear God, there's this concept of obligate adaptation, which is obligate, just like obligated. Yeah. So if we don't do this, we don't have to all have smartphones. We don't have to have all of those apps. But if we don't, how do we stay in touch with everybody else? How do I promote my business? How do I stay in touch with friends? That's where everyone is. That's what all kids say when they're trying to get their parents to get phones, right? That's an obligate adaptation. You don't have to do it. But if you don't do it, you fall behind those who do.
Well, right? You couldn't pay your bills, and now you would be your life would be super miserable without a phone.
Yeah. So take artificial intelligence as a very easy, obvious example, which is, if Google, if OpenAI, if some of these other Anthropic, if some of these other leading companies decided, you know what, we've thought about it, we've heard you guys, and in fact, the joke inside the AI community is the fastest way to bring about artificial general intelligence is to start a non-profit company dedicated to stopping it. Because what inevitably happens is they get bought out.
Yeah.
They get bought out, they get capitalized. So OpenAI was intended, when it was founded with Elon Musk and the others back in the day, was intended to be open source, non-profit, team good guy. They then took on billions of dollars of investment from Microsoft. They're suddenly like, we're shipping products to market as fast as we possibly can. And oh, by the way, the latest is we're going to ask Scarlett Johansson, the actress, to provide the voice to our new ChatGPT, because she did that movie, Her, where she did the voice for an AI. This was like a decade ago. And it was very prescient, right? And Joaquin Phoenix's character falls in love with her as an AI chatbot. So they were like, what a great idea. We'd love to have you be the voice of this thing. And she's just like, she thought about it and she says, that seems a little creepy and a little weird. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm not going to do it. And they released it 2 weeks ago with such a close approximation of her voice that her friends and family were like, Scarlett, did you do this? And so she's now just filed suit against them. Like within this last week. And you're like, oh, that's not a very good sign, guys, which is, artificial, artistic integrity, creative design, integrity of intellectual property, identity, all of these things. You're like, oh my gosh, you guys aren't doing a great job. And then Anthropic broke off from them because they're like, oh, you guys are getting tainted, you're getting bent by this pull to power. We're going to start the really good, the actual good guys. We're going to take the white hat and it'll be us and we're going to do the thing. And then they got huge investment from Amazon and now they are spun up to do the same thing. So obligate adaptations, like, could we go backwards if we wanted to? Is really the question, right?
Yeah.
Because if you assess where we are right now, it's clear that we have, well, I mean, it is, I feel, I wouldn't say it's clear because there's still plenty of discussion about this, but I think it's fair to say, if you really take a look at the evidence, that we have overconsumed. There's a decoupling between our energy consumption and the standards and quality of living, right? Mm-hmm. So we could say, hey, we're probably getting a little greedy and a little wasteful. The United States is the most obvious example because, Europe typically consumes about 6 kilowatt hours per person kind of thing. The US is at double that, 12 kilowatt hours. And and our number one trouble is obesity, right? And Marie Kondo, who was that, Japanese woman, who, like that magic of tidying up. Americans spend $3 billion, I think, a year on storage.
Okay.
Self-storage, not in your home. I have too much stuff and I have to have places to store it that I pay extra money just to hold all my stuff that I might use someday. Mm-hmm. And I have too much calories and 40% of the US is clinically obese. Yeah. And Ozempic, right, some of these drugs that are making their way, give me a pill that makes all the fat go away so I can keep eating all of these excessive calories and processed foods. And oh, by the way, we spend something like 3 or 4 times as much on healthcare and education, and we rank in the 20s and 30s internationally on outcomes. Mm-hmm. So it's very fair to say, you're like, look, we don't, like, and when you have American politicians be like, this is America, and they're coming for our hamburgers, and no one can take away our cars, and our trucks, and you're like, that is just idiocy. So how do we recalibrate fundamentally our carbon consumption to standards of living and quality of life that actually both meet our own needs very selfishly, like how do we become healthier, happier, more connected, and pump the brakes on things that might be catastrophically bad. I mean, if you go all the way back, right, the ancient examples, imagine the earliest hominids, right, our greatest ancestors in the jungles of the Congo, and they come up to their cousins, the bonobos and the chimps and the gorillas, and they're like, hey, we're thinking, I know this is pretty neat Garden of Eden, we're all hanging out in the trees, chilling. I think we're going to climb down out of these trees and we're going to do this whole bipedal thing. We're going to walk across that savanna, check it out, see what's out there. And they're like, yeah, no, this is pretty good. I think we're staying, right? That was a choice, right? And our greatest ancestors hopped down out of those trees and walked into the savanna. And now we put the remnants of our cousins in zoos. Right? That was an obligate adaptation. Mm-hmm. And the next one would be the hunter-gatherers. And the hunter-gatherers, their cousins said, hey, we think we're going to stay put. We think we're going to figure out some of this early wheat and some of this other stuff. We're going to plant it in the ground and we're going to stay here. We're not going to go roaming around for our food. I think we're going to try and make a go of this. And they're like, yeah, no, thanks. We really like our circuit. We like the seasons. We like to be free. We like to have our free time. Why are you going to build ditches and fences and walls and till this earth? Why are you doing that? Why don't you just go where the stuff grows at the time it's growing? And they're like, okay, great. And then, basically a hunter-gatherer has a population density, just as far as energy, that you can generate of about 1 to 10 people per square mile, depending on the region, right? Farmers could have 100 to 1,000 people per square mile. So even if they became rigid, class stratified, gender segregated, labor and toil, bad nutrition, they had 1,000 fucking soldiers to your 10. So even if wisely you made the right ethical, human, cultural decision, the obligate adaptation was higher carrying capacity and population density per square mile, and the people who play that game win and mop up the folks who didn't. And that to me is the root of so much of our present challenge. Like, how do we undo obligate adaptations? Because otherwise it's just this ratchet that
more
constantly
and more.
moves us
Yeah.
forward. And it's not the best or the wisest that win that game. It's just the people that are always willing to double down
Yeah.
on the next bigger, better thing.
It reminds me, like the Christian, like I will come back almost to the story of Cain and Abel. It reminds me a bit Adam and Eve, the temptation with the apple, like how to stay reasonable when there is an apple there, and finally in the end, maybe the humans like will always end up eating the apple.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's echoes of that story in the story of Icarus, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean to have the hubris to fly too close to the sun? Dr. Faustus, what's the deal with the devil for knowledge, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
Like
Temptation.
again and
Yeah,
again and again.
Yeah.
It feels like we are just chaos monkeys that are just too clever for our own good.
Yeah. What the solution would be, because I think the smart people become so smart that the majority of people don't even follow what's happening. Like normal people, reasonable, are not smart enough to follow what the smartest of the smartest are doing. Is it possible, do you think, when one of the solutions would be to raise more reasonable generations of children?
Well, I mean,
You're laughing.
I always joke because, whenever, some big business titan, has billions of dollars and they decide, okay, I'm going to save the world. Think of a Bill Gates or anybody like that, right? And they sort of have grand plans to save democracy or to save civilization or to save the planet or do whatever they do. And they start out at the sort of level of, current symptoms. And then they realize, oh, well, politics or war or government or all of these things are structurally broken. And then they come to the level of, it's the consciousness of the people that's really the problem, right? We can't connect. We can't make ethical, wise, informed decision and coordinate action. So we got to fix the consciousness of the adults in charge. And then after, 10 years of banging their heads against that wall, they're like, nope, these fucking humans are irrecoverable. The cement is dry. This is too late. We actually have to get kids before they become those fucked up adults. And basically every effort to save the world ends up going, if you follow it, down the bottom of the slide to early childhood education. Because, we have some friends at Imperial College in London, and they've been doing a lot of these psychedelic therapy studies. And one of their sort of dark humor jokes about their patients was, this one needs another childhood transplant. Like here's an adult banged up and broken and trying to do their level best to mend, and most of it comes down to adverse childhood events and the direction that they were set in by their family of origin, and harder to unwind than any of us would hope it or want it to be. And of course, on the one hand, everyone's like, focusing on the children. Yay, let's focus on the children. It's infinitely sentimental and nostalgic. But you also realize it's also a crushing verdict on the plasticity or changeability of adults. We wouldn't be going all the way down the slide if we could affect change higher up the ladder. Basically saying this generation is a write-off. We got to catch the next ones before they become as buggered up as this lot.
The trend of self-love and also healing the traumas could help fixing the adults.
I mean, it sort of doesn't to a point. And then it just becomes sort of solipsistic, narcissistic navel-gazing. Because the notion of I'm on my healing journey or
no,
right?
but
Right?
a little bit, like just not too
a
much,
little bit.
of course.
Absolutely.
But,
I mean, my sense is sort of the notion of sort of 80-20 awoken to broken. Because that's the Pareto principle, right? There's always that split of 20% of the things, right, gives you 80% of the results or benefit. 20% of your clothes in your closet you wear 80% of the time, right?
Okay.
And your first 20% of quote unquote personal healing or trauma and integration and all of those things tends to deliver 80% of the breakthroughs you're ever going to get from it.
Okay.
So whether that's a breathwork workshop or whether that's psychotherapy or whether that's psychedelic assisted therapy or whatever it might be, or you know, any kind of, or a religious epiphany and conversion. You take your pick, but the initial breakthroughs deliver an asymmetric amount of, oh my gosh, I'm healed, I'm whole, or I remember what I've forgotten, or I've found my heart, or my love, or my joy for life, or my creativity, or my passion, whatever it might be. But then we don't realize that we're on that Pareto curve. We just think, I put in that little tiny 20% and I got that much return.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Right.
So let me keep going. But it's not. It's a massively diminishing return. So then we go chasing more time, more money, more workshops, more retreats, more therapy, more new experiences, da. But you're chasing, now you have to put 80% more of your time and money to try and harvest the remaining 20% of anything that's going to be any good.
Okay.
And that becomes endlessly self-indulgent, massively, really just an item of privilege and entitlement. It's only for the people that have the time, the resources, the ability to do it. And ironically, doesn't get us where we were hoping we would go anyway, because the last key component for satisfaction and meaning and purpose, once again, is back to connection. It's relationship to others. It's giving back. And especially in a world with such disparate outcomes for so many right now, you realize, if I could just do the first 20% of all of that healing and growth and mending stuff, get 80% of remembering what's mine to do, and having legitimate insights into what I need to mend and patch myself, right? Then instead of becoming self-indulgent, right, turn around and help the people behind you. So instead of trying to get our head above the clouds, where if I only have one more breakthrough or one more next epiphany, then I'll just be floating on clouds and I'll have the life of my dreams, etc., which is a mirage, right? Instead of trying to get my head above the clouds, turn around and try and help anybody behind you, trying to get their head above the water, because there are, the bottom 4 billion humans on this earth are struggling with the basics. And
totally.
right, and we can absolutely, if we deploy our own. I mean, and I thought about this with some dear friends that are in the sort of elite special operations community, right? And we were touring their base where they had all sorts of body, mind, brain, mending, patching, healing things, everything from float tanks to the smartest neurotechnology to all these things. And I realized, oh my gosh, these guys don't come here and then decide they're going to become massage therapists or yoga teachers or breathwork teachers, right? They come here, they say, patch me up, and put me back in the game. Put me back in the game as soon as possible, because I don't want to lose my connection with my team, right? And I don't want to spend a minute not devoting myself to this mission.
Okay.
So for, as long as we have our highest mission in mind, then we use healing and trauma relief and all the therapeutic tools and all these kind of things to simply get us above baseline, where we can get back to the front lines of life, of the world, and of helping wherever we are called to help, versus this becomes an endless self-absorbed journey in isolation. Because you could make a case, right, with capitalism, right, that it has just an absolutely gobsmacking, staggering capacity to consume, devour, neutralize, and inoculate even the most radical and revolutionary techniques and technologies out there. So you take meditation, right? And the big breakthrough was 20 years ago, Jon Kabat-Zinn, an American Jewish meditator, had the savvy idea. He's like, oh, this sounds Eastern and it sounds freaky and it sounds New Agey and all these things, and it's not getting enough uptick. So we're not going to call it meditation anymore. We're going to call it mindfulness-based stress reduction. And now it's in Google, and now it's in Disney, and now it's in all these cool places. And yay, didn't we win? And you're like, no, actually you didn't, because meditation used to be an inquiry into the nature of mind, consciousness, reality, and ethics. And now it is a way to help overstressed office drones manage working 70-hour weeks and not quit or get sick. So capitalism took that, caught it, co-opted it, right? The same with psychedelic therapy. Psychedelics through human history have always been associated directly with sacramental sacred practices.
Okay.
In the 1950s to 60s, Aldous Huxley, all the way through the kind of countercultural movement. They became kind of tools of quote unquote consciousness raising and rebellion and critiquing the existing social structures and dominant paradigms of power, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement, all these like shake the system, tear it down where it's unjust, right? All these things. Now, where basically the psychedelic renaissance is being co-opted by big pharma investment, and we're getting Prozac Nation 2.0. And we're getting healthcare and anxiety and depression and smoking cessation and all of these things, not the Eleusinian mysteries. And you're like, how in the hell does that keep happening? So our emphasis on isolated, consumer, individual zoo animals. It's all about me. It's all about now. And I meet and I'm conditioned to meet and soothe all my needs and my wildest dreams by buying shit. Right? Is a perversion of all human culture ever. And of course, if I've been conditioned my whole life to believe I'm special, main character syndrome is a thing, right? I'm the center of my own movie, and now I'm videotaping it online and posting it for the world to see. Right? And my greatest needs and my greatest fears can all be met via Venmo and Apple Pay. Ding, 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 ding. Now. Not later. Not after some hard work. Not maybe, if I'm a good person. Now. Right? That has conditioned us to be these fractured potted plants. Right? And if you ever go to a nursery or you're trying to, and they're encased in plastic, and if you pull them out, right, their root balls are all tangled because they have no room to grow, and they get sick really easily because they're not dealing with wind and sun and rain that stress them and make them healthy, and they're not connected. And that we won't be able to handle the droughts and storms ahead as isolated potted plants, which is us as conditioned consumer individuals. But what we can be is trees in a forest. And, Louis Schwartzberg, right, was another Harvest Fellow and speaker. He did that beautiful film, Fantastic Fungi, all about the mycelial networks in the forest and how they shunt nutrients and create immune systems and they even photosynthesize for albino trees that can't do it themselves. Like, that's what we need. We need to take our stand in a stand of others. And that's how we support each other, and that's how we thrive in adverse times.
Do you think you're the God you were talking about, the God who's a god, a president or king that would be perfect for the good of the planet, he would decide to suppress the phones?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it doesn't really matter what your project is. None of it can happen when we are glued and distracted and conditioned by the realities. I mean, reality is too strong a word. These simulations that are happening through our screens. So if you're like, I'm anxious, or I'm depressed, or I don't know what to do about the state of the world, or I'd like to become healthy and a peak performer, or take your pick. The first thing that has to happen, and it's not sexy, it's not even fun or remotely interesting, is we have to just own our phones and not have our phones own us.
Jamie, whenever you're writing a book, can you tell me more about the main theme?
Sure. I mean, it's basically, a sort of 100,000-foot view on a lot of what we've been talking about, which is if an anthropologist from space came down to Earth, right, and checked this all out, and then, interviewed the wisest philosophers, scientists, theologians, biologists, and was just like, what is going on this little blue marble, third stone from the sun, right, with this bunch of monkeys with clothes? How have we done this? Where did we come from? What are the drivers of evolution? So what's the sort of biological story? What's the anthropological story? And then what's the psychological story? And you could make a case that, what are the questions we have? What are the questions our children are asking? Why is there suffering in the world? Like, and fundamentally to our earlier points, like, are we doing this wrong? Do we deserve this? Is this because of original sin? Is this because we've screwed it up? Is this because we took a wrong fork? Why is there so much grief and suffering? And why are we so horrible to each other? Right? That's a question. is there a point to all this? Right? Does time have an arrow? Are we going somewhere? Is there a happily ever after? And this is the progress narrative, which if you go all the way back, is arguably a Judeo-Christian concept of alpha and omega. There's a beginning in time and there's an end point, and generally it's jolly hockey sticks. It's a happy, it's a happy fulfillment and culmination.
Yeah.
Are we going somewhere, or is time cyclical? And this is where, there's a joke these days of like, how, sort of a meme online of like, how many minutes has it been since your boyfriend thought about the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Because many, again, this is probably a Silicon Valley kind of meme, but, many people are now studying the collapse of civilizations because seeing ours in such a precarious state, more and more people are like, oh my gosh, this is not
could this happen to us?
Could this happen to us? Oh my! Actually, the moment you look into it, you're like, this has happened to everyone.
Yeah.
Could it also happen to us? So, and there are some people, which this gets very concerning, who are actually gleefully cheering on the collapse of this civilization.
Okay,
and
to prepare the next move.
Yeah, and those are known as, and this is not the same accelerationist, funnily, but it's called accelerationism, which is, let's drive this thing off the cliff. Don't try and save democracy. In fact, there's a rise in monarchists in the United States.
Okay.
There's a rise in, and obviously through Europe with the rise of the populist right again. For the first really time since World War II, we're seeing that rise, and they're saying return to ethno-nationalist states, blood and soil, right? So this whole thing, this global world order with universal humanitarian civil rights and a League of Nations in coordination, bullshit, break it. So if we need to have a story of, is time cyclical, right? Or is time progressive? And is there a way through? Can we fix this, right? Can we solve it and save it? And so my sense is that, the first thing to really understand at a deep level is that evolution is, this is the level of biology, life on this earth, is nothing more nor less than an utterly amoral and indifferent novelty engine.
Okay.
Its whole purpose is to create and generate excessive options and possibilities. 90% of it crashes, 10% persists, and that's how you get new and different.
Okay, yeah.
Right? And that's true at the level of singular cellular life and the literal origins of life. In fact, Dr. Bruce Damer is going to be speaking about this. He has a great phrase where he says, death writes the code for life. From the earliest origins of existence on this planet all the way to how do we have Walmart and Las Vegas? I was taking off on a plane from Las Vegas a few years ago, and I was just looking down at that bizarre city and all the neon lights and all this shit, and you're just like, what on earth is the impulse that created this? And you realize capitalism is a supreme novelty engine. And we think of the booms and busts of capitalism as like this moral failure, right? It's not. It's algae in a pond. It's anything. It's galaxies and stars. It's always massive overproduction, crash and collapse, and then propagation of the fittest that goes past it. So once you understand that, you're like, oh, that's a feature, not a bug. This is not a moral condition. This is just the nature of generation. Okay, now sometimes out of that novelty comes complexity. And complexity, cancer is complex, right? ISIS is complex. There's a lot of things that come out that are not necessarily wonderful, but some things that are increasingly complex are good, true, or beautiful.
Okay.
And we see that emergence, and then we as stewards, self-aware stewards of this evolutionary process, get to say, hey, that stuff, let's do more of that. Let's preserve that. Let's protect that, right? But the trick with a complex system is the complex system needs ever-increasing amounts of energy to keep it going. It's a complex dissipative structure is the name of it, right? And the moment you turn off the tap of extra energy to keep it growing and stable, it dissipates or collapses again. So now we move into the middle part, which is what's the story of civilization? And you can make a case that the story of human civilization, right, has been nothing more nor less than the hunt for ever hotter fire to heat ever more interesting star stuff. Minerals, metals. Right, all of the things that are that have got bombed onto this earth from asteroids and meteors and all this stuff, right? All of the gold, all the cool stuff, right, came from space and slammed into this planet. And we've been digging it up, and we've been trying to figure out how to create hotter and hotter fires to smelt it. So if you think about the Stone Age is really a bit of a misnomer. Like, we learned to rub two sticks together. Fire allowed us to both keep away animals. It allowed us to stay up at night. It also allowed us to cook food, which completely changed our structure. Like, our jaws changed because we didn't need these massive jaws to chew raw stuff.
Okay.
Our brains grew, our stomachs shrunk, all because we could cook and make more accessible a whole range of nutrients, right? And that was just quick cycle carbon. It was trees that were growing. It was animal dung. It was whatever we could light on fire, right? Simple. But then the Stone Age is a misnomer. It was also the Wood Age. It was just all that stuff rotted because we don't see it, right? But most of the things were made with stones and bones and heating and tempering in a fire, right? Then you get to the sort of the Pottery Age, right? Can we actually cure clay and soils in a kiln-like thing? So we're like, oh, that's amazing. Now we can store grains. We can start playing that game of extending our energy reserves. Then you get into the Bronze Age. We could like copper plus tin equals bronze. That's amazing. Let's do that and make swords and civilization, right? That collapses. Then we get into the Iron Age. Then we go all the way into the steel and nuclear age. And now we're taking radioactive materials and creating fires so hot they're hotter than our sun.
Right.
And you're like, oh my, and even like silicon, we talked about teaching sand to think. We just take for granted the silicon chips in our phones and the silicon chips that can make artificial intelligence. They require taking incredibly pure, very specific grains of sand. They're only available in 1 or 2 quarries in the entire world, and heating them to 1500 degrees 2 or 3 times in their manufacturing process in vacuum airtight labs. And we're now creating these micro, like to literally 9 decimal places of purity, which is why China, by the way, hasn't been able to rip off Taiwan yet on semiconductor production. They can take it to 8 decimal places, and you need it actually to 9 for the fastest silicon chip. So this is what we've been doing. It's the hunt for ever denser carbon to create ever hotter fires, right? to melt ever hotter star stuff. And so you're like, holy shit, that is super, super fascinating. And then what do we do with this story? So now, for the first time in human history, we've both dug up that one-time bonanza of fossilized starlight, right, which was fossil fuels, right? And we are at this place where it's like, wait, for the first time ever, might we be able to decouple our carbon consumption from our standard of living? Can we do it? And whether that's wind and solar and renewables, or whether that's more nuclear power, or it's fusion, or it's something else we haven't figured out yet, like capturing sunlight in space and beaming it down. Can we do that? And can we do that before we fall off the cliff of our current late-stage capitalist, carbon-dependent civilization, right? Because like Einstein said that famously, right? He said if the Third World War is fought with nuclear weapons, the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones.
Okay,
Right?
Right.
So can we harness this last gasp of a hydrocarbon-intensive civilization, right? To and techno-industrially very advanced, lasers, silicon chips, transistors, vacuums, nuclear large hadron colliders, all the shit we built with all of this extra excess energy. Can we actually use the last gasp of this moment to then innovate and design and distribute what's next before we run out or cook the planet or succumb to mass, intercontinental civil wars? Right? And so, to me, the only solution, the only is a strong word. Most of what gets hyped these days is whiz-bang, moonshot technologies, right? Tesla's in every driveway. We're going to have, everybody will be electric. Everybody will be, with renewable batteries, and we will have wind and solar and all the whiz-bang stuff. And we will have artificial intelligence as our great God telling us how to fix all the stuff we've messed up in the past, et cetera. And you realize, oh my gosh, that has so much extremely high embedded energy in it, right? Like, for instance, it takes, 90% plus of all the solar panels in the world are produced in China, being made by coal-fired power plants. Like, that doesn't actually fucking work. You're like, you can't go green by burning dirty coal in China to build your non-renewable solar panels. Those aren't actually renewables. They are rebuildables. Renewables are trees, right? So my sense is that rather that a future that might work for as many humans as possible, I doubt it's 8 billion, right? But for as many humans as possible, is going to look less like Star Trek and Elon Musk than it might Buckminster Fuller and Swiss Family Robinson, right? So if you take Star Trek, Elon Musk is impossibly high in bed energy and possibly high tech, very, very hard to scale for anybody in the global south ever. So they're just not going to get it, right? There might be 1 billion people that go off in their Teslas with their air conditioning and their and their water and their holodecks to make their foods. The rest will just snuff it. Mm-hmm. So if we're really trying to do a humanitarian play, it would be saying what is highly engineered, that's the Buckminster Fuller element, right? Highly engineered, low embedded energy, that's the Swiss Family Robinson element, right? Beautiful solutions. And because the solutions, right, if you think about, again, that sort of anthropologist from space, and you even look at the arc of human history, you're like, we've had amazing solutions. If you look at architecture from the past, Persia had those vertical windmills in the desert that served as water pumps. Many cultures, whether it's minarets in the Middle East or any kind of spires where there might be like an underground cistern or an aquifer, and then they would have a thermal vent to go out the top, and it would forever pull cool air from the low in the ground and up, and there's sort of natural air conditioning. There's you take a look at the trade in the Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea was the first place that upwind sailing was ever figured out. Okay. Right. So it used to be, right? You could only go with the trade winds, whichever way the wind was blowing. And then you'd have to wait half a year until it changed direction and go back that way, right? That was the age of exploration. Now you could sail upwind. Game changing. Mm-hmm. Now we can go anywhere. It might take a bit longer, but we can get upwind. Radical. So you're like, okay, what on this planet are the tools we have to work with? Because the closer you can work with natural impulses, the less energy it takes. People are doing container farming right now, like shipping containers. And can you grow food inside a shipping container? It's like, yeah, you can, but you're trying to simulate the sun, which shoots down its photons for free. You're trying to simulate rain, right? Which hopefully happens on a periodic seasonal basis, and a farmer knows when and how. Yeah. Less so true now, right now. And we're spending all this energy in a closed environment to simulate natural processes.
So to add the nutrients.
And you've got to introduce synthetic fertilizers that are also fossil fuel derived, right? From the Haber-Bosch process, right? And nitrogen fertilizer and ammonia generation, which was first used to fuel V2 rockets in World War II, but then became the reason half of the world's population today, which doubled from 1971 to now, would not be alive were it not for synthetic fossil fuel fertilizers. So you're like, oh no, what do we do now? So the whole green revolution or agricultural boom happened because we took fossil fuels, converted it into ammonia, converted that into nitrogen, and sprayed it all over crops. And because we used to have to do crop rotations, right, where you would leave one field fallow, and now we don't do that at all. We just juice them with synthetics. And now if we went back to leaving fields fallow, we would end up with famine in those countries because we've all become adapted to that much consumption. So if you just go to what are the tools we have in our kit? Like, once again, as little humans on this blue marble, you realize, okay, here's this planet. It's got a 22-degree tilt. So that gives us seasons. And seasons provide contrast, right? And that is wonderful for life, for growth, for health, all sorts of things. It's also spinning, right? And that gives us the Coriolis effect. So that gives us wind and ocean currents, the jet streams and the Gulf streams, right? The mid-Atlantic meridional currents, right? It takes heat and energy from one place and it takes it somewhere else. That's how we navigated. That's why England, which is actually as far north as Nova Scotia, but England has incredibly temperate climates for how far north it is, all because of the currents that carry warm water. There, it's asymmetrically warm and temperate. And in fact, one of the quick concerns right now is, are those ocean currents going to flip? So the places that have been deep and cold are now going to become warm, and the places that were warm might become cold, which will radically change all farming all around the world, within the span of a handful of years. Like one of the fastest changes you could ever imagine would be catastrophic. So, but we have the Coriolis effect. We also have the hydrologic cycle, right? Water evaporates from the seas and the oceans, Clouds carry it up into the mountains, it comes down as snow, and gravity pulls it down streams to rivers, right, to lakes and oceans. That's how we created windmills and water mills, right? And we've got sailing, and then we've got a core of magma, and you've got insulation. So you've got geothermal, right? You've got the idea of digging down 6 feet, tends to be 50 degrees, more or less, steady year round. You dig down deeper, and you've got actually heat and warmth that you can pull from the earth. So we kind of have these basic things that are just the nature of being alive on this planet. And earliest humans, that's how we started building stuff. We started sailing, right? We built earthen homes. We had natural modes of cooling. We absolutely made the use of currents and trade. We made use of seasons. Oh, and we've also got a moon. And the moon, this is crazy, it was 3 times the size when it first slammed into and broke off the earth, and then it kind of whittled itself down to our current size, which gives us diurnal tides, right? And tidal situations create all kinds of life and activity. So these are the things that and again, tidal energy harvesting. There's lots of demo projects of how do we make use of tidal energy for hydroelectrics. So you're like, okay, so that's our toolkit. And it's only, humans have relied on all of those things up till the last couple of 100 years, when we discovered this one-time lucky stash of 100 million years of buried starlight, and decided we could just wallet whip everything with just more free energy than we'd ever even thought was possible. So arguably, now we have 8 billion humans, not 1 billion humans, which was how many we had when we discovered oil, right?
Yeah.
Can we go back to the Buckminster Fuller, Swiss Family Robinson, making use of what is actually the dynamics and the resources and the functions of life on this earth to make increasingly ingenious, so keep all of our technology, all of our insights, all of our inventiveness, but just back way the hell off on the over-reliance on non-renewable energy inputs and high embedded energy outputs.
So moonshot technologies are the hope. Yeah.
Well, I would say earthshot.
Okay.
You know, I mean, moonshot is the sort of Silicon Valley hype machine. And that's actually going to be one of the questions we're hopefully discussing for our last dinner at this harvest. Okay. Because I was just with some of the folks from SpaceX and Neuralink, which is that implant company, and OpenAI, and MAPS, which is the sort of leading psychedelic society. And I thought, okay, this is very interesting, because all of these, you know, those 4 organizations and the kind of the industries they represent are all moving towards a similar thing, which is sort of us as spacefaring, cyborg, psychedelically enhanced transhumanoids, you know, surfing the galaxy, you know, with artificial intelligence running the show, or do we think that there is something unique or precious about this planet, our home planet? Or was this just a starter house? That's a profound ethical conversation, because if we think we fucked this one up and our only hope is to get off it as fast as possible, that has a cascade of ethical and socio-political implications. So is this home a gift? Is this a garden? It's ours to tend and mend? Or is this just a stepping stone to our future trillions as a spacefaring species? That's a profound conversation that I think we all need to be having, not just a few Asperger guys in Silicon Valley. And then the next one is carbon-based intelligence, aka us, right? We're all carbon-based life forms here on this planet. Is carbon-based intelligence and our own self-awareness, you could even say the human spirit, is that something unique or precious? Or, as Sam Altman, right, the founder of OpenAI said, he said, well, there's only 2 futures. Either we become cyborgs, or we become what he calls a bootloader to silicon consciousness, meaning that all we do is just, we are the monkeys with opposable thumbs that taught sand to think, and then sand takes over from here and we go extinct.
So it doesn't give...
And, you know, so is there something precious about here? Is there something precious about us? Or not? Because the or not is actually all the folks building this stuff. And it feels like that is enough of a consequential conversation that we should have all of our minds and hearts dedicated.
Instead of buying more stuff.
Instead of flicking and scrolling
Yeah.
and getting stuck in culture wars
Yeah.
and or buying stuff to distract us and divert us.
Jamie Wheal, thank you so much.
For sure.
And we'll ask all these questions during Harvest. What an introduction with Jamie Wheal. Thank you, Jamie.
Sure.